Welcome, everybody. We're going to talk today about sustainable beekeeping and the Ipm Pyramid, or how chemical-free interventions are enough for troubleshooting in your hives. There's a lot of talk about treating bees against various ailments and pests, including the dreaded Viramites. And today I'm here to tell you a little bit more about the alternative to this and how to keep your bees without necessarily resorting to those what we consider extreme interventions, so that we can keep them healthier. So let's get started. My name is Natalie. I'm a Texas A&M master beekeeper. I've been beekeeping for about 7 years, and I even went to the Congo to train Congolese rural farmers on beekeeping, and in more particular on tabar hives. And I'm also the president of the, I'm the past president of the Hays County Beekeepers Association. I'm currently the vice president, and I'm also the organizer of the World Bee Day Natural Beekeeping webinar every year on May 20th. We started doing that last year. And the other thing that I'm doing is I'm the co-host now of the Hive Jive podcast. I'm in charge of the Natural Beekeeping Corner every first Monday of the month. If you listen to podcasts, or even if you don't right now, I highly recommend it. It's hosted by John Swan, the Texas Beekeepers Association vice president. He's a great host, and it's a very informative podcast. So I really highly recommend it. And then I work with Les Crowder, who's an expert beekeeper who needs almost no introductions. He's also a biologist and also an Eastern philosopher. He's Therese, do you mind muting your recording?
Sure.
Thank you, I appreciate that. He's also the author of Tabar Beekeeping, Organic Practices for Honeybee Health, which is a really, really good little book that applies not just to tabar hives, but all kinds of beekeeping hives. And it's the principles that are very important in this book. So if you haven't read this, I highly recommend it. Most, like not all Beekeepers Association, but the ones that have a landing library typically will have that, but you can find it just about anywhere as well. So together we run Be Mindful. Excuse me, I have allergies. And I'm going to be doing that a little bit throughout the presentation. I apologize in advance. We run Be Mindful, which is a natural beekeeping company. And this is where you can get a hold of me if you have questions after this presentation at be-mindful.com. You can even text me or email at bemindfulhoneyfarms@gmail.com. So feel free to do that, absolutely. In addition, we host every Thursday, and some of you have seen on here, I see my friend Andrew from Canada, and Jennifer in Houston, and other people here are attending the weekly chat with the mindful beekeepers with Les and I, which is a free beekeeping question and answers that we host every Thursday from 5 to 6, both on Instagram at Be Mindful Honey Farms and on via Zoom. And the link is going to be on our Facebook page and on our website. But if you go to the Instagram, you can see some past discussions, and we answer people's questions basically. So you can curate your questions and bring them over and listen, or you can send them to us. We'll answer them as we can, and then you can watch the recording if you miss it. So the agenda for today, let's talk about things like failure rate comparisons, IPM definition, what is the integrated pest management definition, why it's important, what its underlying premises and implications are, and then the various levels of the IPM, what we call pyramid. It can be represented by a pyramid just like the food pyramid. And then how we can use it to do troubleshooting, to troubleshoot our beehives and their problems without using chemicals. So in a way, it's kind of like introducing the concept of best practices for natural beekeeping. And then we'll do some parting words after that. But first of all, this is more for the skeptics. There's always skeptics when it comes to natural beekeeping and sustainable beekeeping, not using chemical treatments. This is a Warri Hive that I've had for almost 7 years now. And it started as a package from a reputable treatment-free beekeeper in Texas. And basically what I did is I put it into the box and never fed them, never treated them, and just kept adding the boxes as they were growing. And this is what it looks like in the spring with a brand new comb, and it's got windows so we can see through it. I've never disrupted, I never inspected. I know it's not what I would recommend typically, but this is what I've done with this one. And it serves to me as a proof of concept, right? Because if these bees can do it, there's no reason. You cannot tell me that if you don't treat your bees, they're gonna die. I've got the example, real life, that it's not the case. However, I would like to remind you, and this little bee on the poor little sad looking little bee on the left is a reminder of, is that bees, honeybee colonies die naturally in the wild, and their chances of survival in their first year before they're established are really high. I think in the 70-75% failure rate. It's only when they get more established that they are a little bit more resilient. But even then, in natural circumstances, there's a fairly high rate of failure, from about 30 to 40% on average. So just keep that in mind when people are comparing rates of losses, that naturally honeybee colonies die, and that's what natural selection does. It just weeds out the weaker ones, and the ones that are not quite yet as established, that haven't managed to get into their second year, they get weeded out a lot more heavily than this more established hives that are more adapted and are able to fend for themselves. So let's go into the definition of IPM. IPM stands for Integrated Pest Management. It's really a pest management strategy that combines tactics of various level of intervention to reduce the pest populations and pathogen impact on the health of the colony. And it does that as non-intrusively and as effectively as possible. So the goal is to give the bees the tools that they need in a managed environment, because we're keeping them in the box. We're giving them the tools, we're stacking the deck for them with as many interventions as we need that are going to help them be successful. And it starts first of all by being educated on what a life cycle of a colony is, of a single honeybee is, what a healthy colony looks like, things like that. And I'm going to get into detail, so let me not get ahead of myself. But the various levels of the 5 levels of the Integrated Pest Management Pyramid in my book is educational, cultural, physical, biological, and chemicals. And that comes up in the pyramid that we're going to talk about in a minute. The implications is that it's a sustainable way to keep your bees. It's science-based, it's based on research, just like the management of livestock in other industries, cattle, sheep, anything. They use integrated pest management, and so does the beekeeping industry. It's recommended by the Apiary Inspection Services, and it's a decision-making process that helps you figure out what you can do to help out your bees when they're subjected to various stressors. It helps mitigate the environmental threats that they're exposed to, that it's hard to control for us, especially environmental stressors. And it also helps prevention is big, but it also helps identifying and managing, as well as reducing the risks that are associated with those pests and pathogens that, just like with all other animals, are pestering the colonies, the animal that is a colony of honeybee. And the ultimate goal of the IPM strategies for all livestock is to decrease the resistance to treatments and to keep those treatments as a last resort intervention for the things that where nothing else has worked in case of the management in the managed situation of livestock. So this is a representation of the IPM pyramid. It looks kind of like the food pyramid, and follows the same principle, where the base of it is wider than the tip of it, because what you need most of is the bottom, and then the least of is the top of the pyramid. And it emphasizes the aspect of prevention over, let me decrease, I see everybody and myself and it's distracting me. So It's the goal of it is that if you start at the bottom of the pyramid and you follow those bottom steps, you are focusing on prevention of problems rather than intervention after the problems arise. So it's very, very important, that concept of prevention versus intervention after the fact. You want to prepare and just like when all animals, you want to keep them in good health, you want to give them good conditions of living, you want to minimize the stressors so that you minimize the risk of diseases appearing. Excuse me. So let's talk a little bit more details about the first level of the integrated pyramids. And you're going to notice at the top right, I've got a little traffic lights, and what I'm using those is to signify where we recommend you, what you recommend you use and where we recommend you stop. So this is a green level, and the first 3 levels of the pyramids is what we consider as being green. The fourth one being a little bit more, it's because mostly it's not as efficient. So we stop before that, but then the 5th one, we choose to not use that level. So identification and understanding of pests, and basically education level. Knowing both what the symptoms and the pests themselves and pathogens look like is very important. It comes from education. And what you need to know is the biology and the life cycle of each of those pests, of the honeybee, as well of the pathogens, not just the pests actually, because it's the foundation for disrupting its reproduction and limiting the damage that it can cause. If you understand and are able to diagnose the problems, you're better able to disrupting it before it becomes seriously damaging. And then that means that you need to understand how a healthy colony of honeybee looks like and how it behaves to start with. If you don't even know how a healthy colony of honeybee looks like and how it behaves, then you have no way to know when there's a problem, when it's not behaving normally. So it's very important to first start with educating yourself about the life cycle and the biology of the honeybee, both at the individual level, when an egg hatches, turns into a larvae, pupates, and emerges as an adult, as well as at the colony level. What are the life cycles, and what does it look like when they've got enough food, when they've got enough brood, if the brood looks healthy. So that's part of that understanding of what a healthy colony of honeybee looks like and behave. And then the other part of this level is to understand the main pests, to know about the main pests and pathogens. So when a main pest is an outside organism that is putting a pressure on the honeybee. Perfect example is the Veramites, or another one would be the small hive beetles or the wax moths. All those pests are organisms on their own that are like either insects or usually insects or acarians. Acarians is the technical term for mites. The tracheal mites are another pest, and things like that. Pathogens is more diseases, bacterial and viruses. So microorganisms that are actually impacting the organism of the honeybee itself or the colony as a whole. So it's very important to understand their life cycle and to learn to identify the symptoms of their expression when they become visible. And that allows a beekeeper to intervene before the problem becomes significantly bad. If you start seeing issues with melted larvae, for example, you might have some bacterial issues. You are more able, if you can recognize excuse me, if you can recognize those signs, to intervene and use some of those interventions that are recommended by the Integrated Pest Management Pyramid. So the implications of that first level and what I've just said is that you need to understand, again, that life cycle of the colony, where it goes through the spring, summer, late summer, and the cycles and how it follows the weather and forage in the area, as well as what that means in the hive. If you have in full nectar flow a hive that has no brood and very few bees, you have an issue. If you have, in the fall, you've got drone looking, popcorn looking cells that are not within drone season. Maybe you've got some issues with your queen. So some of the signs that you that can help you diagnose an issue are part of understanding that life cycle of that colony. And in addition, you need to understand what happens with the swarm cycles and raising queens and how they store their food, and what all that healthy brood looks like, and when it picks up with the nectar flow, when it slows down, and when the bird's nest contracts with dearth, when there's usually no food, there's not much egg laying, and that doesn't mean there's something wrong with your queen, but it might, if it happens during a full nectar flow, then that's a sign there's something wrong. So the other aspect of this is that you need to realize that the complete elimination of common pests and pathogens is very rarely possible. You're always going to see, or it's very likely that you're going to see at least a couple of small hive beetles, maybe one wax moth, maybe two or three Veramites. Even when you're counting your Veramites, you might have levels above 1 or 2%, and that's that it doesn't mean that you have to bring those levels down to 0. Those viruses and bacteria are always present at a latent stage, like a non-expressed stage. It's only when the stressors are too much for the colony that things start to express themselves. Infestation of small hive beetles, of wax moths, of mites, of foul brood, of bacteria, and things like that. So those viruses, those deformed wing, all the stuff, when the pressure is high, the stressors are high on the colony, that's when those start to express themselves. However, having a little bit, I mean, it's kind of like hand in hand, having a little bit of those pressures, those stressors, puts pressures on the bees to get stronger and to have a healthier, just like if we are in a bubble, we're not going to have a strong immune system. Having a little bit of exposure to some of the crud that's out there is going to allow your immune system to get primed and have more strength and more tools to react in the presence of those. It's the principle of vaccines as well. So realize that the symbiotic microbial and yeast relationships within the superorganism are very important. The gut microbiomes and the way they use things like propolis and the volatile compounds that result of it, the pheromones, all this stuff, all the microbial tools that they use, the probiotics, the fungi they use to pickle their pollen to make it bee bread, all that stuff is very tightly interconnected in the superorganism, and that's something that we need to keep in mind because we don't want to disrupt those symbiotic relationships. And that's all our interventions have unintended consequences that we might or might not be able to witness. So it's very important to not intervene in a colony of honeybee lightly and willy-nilly, if it's a technical term. So to go back to the identification and understanding of some issues in the colonies, one of the biggest tools is to be able to read a brood frame, right? Knowing that the one on the left looks really good because it's got a tight brood pattern and very few little cells that are open, and it's filling up the entire frame here, looks healthy to me. However, if I see the one on the other side that's looking very spotty, very with some raised cells and lots of empty cells everywhere, that might be an indicator that there's an issue. And that might be an indication of pests or pathogens. And it's not just Veramites, by the way, it could be something else, as bees express a certain level of hygienic behavior and will pull out disease or dead larvae. The other thing that people don't think about very often is that it could also be a representation of inbreeding. And that's going to bring me to a point that I think is very important, is that very often issues that you have with colonies, whether it's with pests and pathogens, and especially when it comes to Veramites, people will say, if you see a spotty brood pattern, it's because you have Veramites. And it's not necessarily the case. And I think that those pests and pathogens, all of them actually, are more an indication that there's something wrong at a deeper level. Those are a symptom of a bigger problem. And the root cause, in my opinion, is bad queens that are either poorly bred or inbred and end up conveying their poor genetics or their poor offspring. And or in the case of inbreeding, you have a lot of diploid drones, which are not viable, that the bees will remove and pull out, which can create that very specific spotty brood pattern. And that can be mistaken for other things like parasitic mite syndrome and spotty brood pattern from mite infestations. So keep that in mind. It's not all black and white. It's very complex. And going in saying, well, it's automatically Veramites, and if I take care of Veramites, everything's going to be good, is absolutely not true. So I just wanted to make sure that the understanding and being able to identify what's going on in your hive is super important. So one of the things that you can do to increase your chances of being able to do that is to learn with qualified teachers and potentially get into a master beekeeper program. The Texas beekeeper program, master beekeeper program, is really good. And also, when you get started, you only have just a few hives. You don't have as much frame time, which is very important. Being able to go in your hives and watching them on a regular basis and without stressing them gets hard to do when you have only a couple of hives, right? If you work with beekeeping buddies, or if you are lucky enough to go work with somebody that's got a lot of hives and they bring you along with them to go into their hives, you're going to be able to see a lot more frames, increase your frame time, and increase your chances of being able to identify and understand problems more easily. If you've got only those couple of hives, you're going to be tempted to go in every week and too often and for too long, and it's going to be really a stressor to your colonies, and we highly recommend against that. But understanding how to read the comb and knowing the life cycle of, and the symptoms of the pests and pathogens is going to help you read those frames. So that's very important. So let's talk more specifically about the Veramites. And I'm not going to get into the details of the life cycle of the Veramites, but basically what happens is that you get the queen will lay some eggs, and as the nurse bees are feeding the larvae and they get to the 5th instar, right before they get to capping, a foundress mite, which is an adult female that's been mated, will sneak through past the bees and under the larvae into the brood food, pull out a snorkel so that she can breathe, but it doesn't get noticed. And then as the bees cap the larvae, she's going to get out and start feeding on that larvae, transmitting some of those viruses to the larvae. But in addition, she lay a male egg to start with. And then after that, every 13 hours or so, she'll start laying female eggs. So the first female eggs that hatch will mature, and then they will mate with their brother. They only male into the cell. And usually mites can have 1.5 to 3 daughters that are going to make it to the time when the bee is chewing through her capping and gets out, and they'll be at that point mated and viable, and along with the mother, they'll come out and they will hitchhike another bee or just get out in another cell, and the cycle will start over. Usually that happens more into the drone drone larvae, because they're larger excuse me, and they take longer to reproduce. And the reason behind that is that these Veramites didn't evolve with the European honeybees, they evolved with Asian honeybees that are larger, and so they're able to produce on those larger worker brood over there. But when they transferred over to European honeybees, those bees were smaller, so they prefer the drone brood because they are larger and take longer, which means more cycles of the mites more daughters can be raised. So there's a reason for that. And so what happens, you end up with bees that are pooling. Some of those, some bees have hygienic sensitive to Veramites. That's that VSH, Vera-sensitive hygienic traits, and they will be really good at smelling the mites and figuring out how to clean those out. And between that and the viruses that are being transferred, like this, this is a deformed wing virus, which is kind of a one of the expressions of an issue into the hive with parasitic mite syndrome. They will some of the bees will clean out some of those diseased or dying or dead bees, because when you've got that stressor in the colony, you've got the higher the stressor, the more and the less able to defend itself the colony is, the more expression of those issues, of those viruses, of those European firebroods, of all those issues that can plague the colony. So if you see that, you should be concerned, both because this one looks more to me like parasitic mite syndrome. You see some multi-white larvae, but it could also be, if you only saw the spotty bird pattern, it could be that inbreeding I was talking about. And by the way, that inbreeding creates weaker colonies that are more susceptible to those issues. Whereas if you have good, strong queens and the colony is healthy and has been able to develop strategies to fend off those pests and pathogens, then they will be able to thrive in the presence of those mites at similar levels that other colonies that are not as strong genetically wouldn't be able to sustain. And another point I want to make about the Veramites is that they leverage, obviously, the brood cycles of the colony, which means the more brood rearing there's going on, the more they're able to reproduce, which is why we see them increase in population as just after the population of honeybees start increasing, and they still have like that effect afterwards. So my point here is that if you push your bees by feeding them on a constant basis sugar syrup and especially pollen and pollen supplements, and you prevent them from following the cycles of weather and forage, and prevent them from having those natural brood breaks that they otherwise would have, you are encouraging the increase in population of Veramites, so that you know. So what we're doing here is all linked, and it behooves us to not feed on a constant basis and not provide and not force brood rearing, and then only to treat afterwards because we've created a problem. So keep that in mind. That's very important in my book. And feeding should be kept only for emergency purposes and special goals, such as queen rearing or a split, or something that's going on. But mostly emergency. You install a package, it comes with nothing, it's been forced into it, that's an emergency. You have a hive that's got nothing left because, the cold spell that was not expected for our area, that's through no fault of their own, and now they need some help, that's an emergency. And even then, I would recommend only feeding leftover of your own honey. Crystallized honey is fantastic for that. There's issues with sugar syrup, but in some cases, if that's a true emergency and you don't want to lose the bees, and maybe you can consider that. But I talked a little bit about that parasitic mite syndrome. I wanted to show you a little bit more details what it looks like. This is some of the signs of parasitic mite syndrome. You see like melty larvae, some that are encapped as the bees are monitoring them, some are gray, so that are looking like really kind of like yellowish and dark, and obviously that doesn't look very good when you see that. They should all be white and plump and healthy looking. But the other sign would be something like the deformed wing virus that you see here. So there's a few things that you see on this slide that are problematic and symptomatic of parasitic mite syndrome. And let's talk about small hive beetles, which is another pest that beekeepers complain about quite a bit. And this is what they look like. They look like those mini scarabs, and they use those, they kind of like mini tanks. They can, turtles, they can just kind of get under that shell, and the bees can't do anything to them for the most part. They make those little larvae that sometimes will infest your honey and slime it. And this is when it gets out of hand and things look bad. What they look for so it's part of that education that you need to understand is that they look for protein. They need those proteins to reproduce, so they're going to look initially through pollen combs and pollen cells and brood comb and eat through those. And then when it gets really bad and those larvae are too many, they'll start infesting your honey and slime it. So how is that important to, again, understand the life cycle? If you want to, excuse me, I apologize. So you want to understand the life cycle so you can potentially disrupt it. So how does it work? Well, a small hive beetle that smells an opportunity will just fly into a hive, and we'll get back to that. But when the door is wide open and the entrance is big, that makes it easier. When you're using a small screen bottom board, they can get through it when they're smaller, because that 1/8 of an inch doesn't stop smaller adults. And also it attracts them through the smell that's being diffused more efficiently when you have a screen bottom board or a wide entrance. And also they can smell the stress in a colony. So that all that stuff's going to attract them, and they're going to walk in or fly into the hive. And what happens when they're inside, they will look for cracks and crevices and places to hide, because the bees will coral them into small hive beetle prisons that they make out of propolis, or they kind of try to block them and keep them there. They're smart though, because they know that they can stroke the antennas of the bees and induce them to feed them even when they're in prison, so they don't die in those prison of hunger. They just can they wait for the opportunity for them to be able to get out when there's no protection of old brood comb or resources in a colony that gets weaker. And by the way, a colony that gets weaker smells and attracts the small hive beetles. So it's kind of linked there. The other thing I would mention is that in this is a Langstroth frame, and Langstroth equipment, especially those frames, they provide a lot of opportunities for the small hive beetles to hide in cracks and crevices, and it's very hard for the bees to protect all those areas. And that's why you will see them very often on top of the frames, also right under your inner cover. That's why I personally, and that's my own bias, but I personally like top bar hives better, because there's very few places for those small hive beetles to hide. And that's part of the integrated pest management intervention, is decreasing the chances of those pests and pathogens to take a hold on your colony. So, but to go back to the life cycle of the small hive beetle, if they find the opportunity, they will deposit lots of eggs in crevices or comb cells that are, not protected. And then at that point, you're going to have those larvae that are going to come out. And when they're fed on that pollen, that brood, that protein that's all over the place, they will end up leaving the hive, crawling out, and going into the ground to pupate until they emerge. Excuse me. And then the cycle starts over. So understanding that cycle, just like with the Viramites, where we were talking about allowing for those bird breaks, natural bird breaks to happen, that would slow down the cycle of reproduction. That's the same here. If you understand this, you can do a few things, including minimizing the chances of them walking into your hive, but also you can use things like nematodes into the ground that are going to eat through those nymphs that are transforming into the ground. Or you can use mechanical barriers like finely crushed limestone under the hive, or something that's going to prevent those small hive beetles to go and pupate into the ground. And that's going to really help control the cycle of those small hive beetles. And the other thing so that was the identification, understanding of pests, their life cycles, their biology, so that you can intervene and break those cycles and prevent it from happening in the first place. So now let's talk about cultural control and sanitation. That's a very important step as well. That's things like using good queens that are actually locally adapted. So you see that queen with that Hawaiian hat and all the stuff. You don't want to use that. You don't want to use Georgia bees that have been imported to Texas, because they're not going to be adapted to those cycles of weather and forage. And they're not going to be as resilient because of that. That's going to be more stressful for them to be here. You also want to make sure that you use queens that are of good stock, survivor stock, untreated stock. So we like to say untreated local survivor stock, because the only survivor stock, by the way, is bees that haven't been treated. The ones that have been treated are not survivor. They need medication to make it. So survivor stock is paramount, especially local. The other thing is that you want to make sure that you're using hybrid vigor in your favor, instead of depressing your bees via inbreeding. What that means is that you don't want to keep always breeding the same bees. You want to kind of try to bring in a diversity into your apiary as much as possible. And a very good source, a fantastic source of bees and diversity and good local survivor stock is to catch swarms and do removals and all stuff. That's a little technical, and people like Jennifer Scott in Houston can do that very well. But for you and I that are not remover specialists, catching swarms is a great way to get a local survivor stock, and or maybe working with your other beekeepers that you trust. And you might end up with bees that are escaped from managed apiaries, treated apiaries, the stock that's not resistant, but you might also, with that wide net, catch really good stock. And what you do is, instead of requeening it when you get a swarm, you shouldn't requeen it at all. You should let it grow and show you what they can do. Give them an opportunity, because they might actually be very well be a great stock that's locally adapted and comes from survivor stock. So the other thing is, if you're using queens that either you're raising yourself or you're purchasing, you want to make sure that they're well fed as a larvae, because if they're well fed as a larvae, they're going to be stronger, bigger, and they're going to be going out and get better mated, and then the likelihood of them coming back will be higher. But what's most important is that they will be well mated. If you buy them from a breeder, make sure that the breeder is letting them lay eggs for a couple, 3 weeks before they harvest them to sell, because it will allow it to develop their ovaries and their laying system a lot better. It will be a much better quality queen as well. So that's very important. For that, we recommend, we have a map, and I'll talk about that later. We have a map on our website at bee-mindful.com of untreated survivor stock in the United States and Canada, whatever. It's a crowdsourced excuse me, map. So Jennifer Scott's on it, we are on it, there's people like bee weavers on it, and then Michael Bush and all kinds of providers that can help you out. And if you live in a area where you're looking for local survivor stock, I would go there and take a look and see if there's somebody nearby that can provide you those if you're purchasing them. And if not, somewhere as close as possible, somebody that might be able to help you out from that map. You can contact them and say, hey, I'm like so many miles away from you. Do you know anybody where I am that has good untreated local survivor stock? So that's one way to get that stock if you're purchasing. The other cultural, this is one is more sanitation. You want to avoid cross-contamination. That's common sense. Don't, bring contaminated or sick colonies into another apiary. Don't swap frames of contaminated colonies with another one. Try to keep your hive tool disinfected between colonies. So I'm going to say something that we do some of these things and we don't do some of the other things based on what works for us. But the important thing to remember throughout all those steps is that you don't have to do all of them. However, the more of them you do, the more you're stacking the deck in your favor, or in the favor of the bees, actually. So keep that in mind. You don't have to do all this stuff, but the more the better. However, I would say something about old comb. Old comb culling is also a good one. So when you have comb like this is still kind of okay. It's getting quite dark, and it's pretty near getting removed from the colony, because as soon as you cannot see the sun through it on natural comb, then it's too old and there's too many cocoons, too many viruses accumulated in there, and it's just unsanitary. So rotating through your frames or your bars, and moving out that old comb out of the hive progressively on a cycle of every 2-3 years could really help keeping your colony growing into a sanitary environment. So very too often beekeepers will have, especially in Langstroth, because it's heavy, it's hard. So if you have like several levels, you don't want to go through the brood box at the bottom. You're kind of looking at honey, kind of taking a look at the top level, and you're not going to go in the bottom because everything else looks good. Well, you end up having the comb that sits in there for so long, and it gets dark and nasty, and it's not good for the bees. So that needs to get cycled out. It's very easy to do, by the way, with the horizontal beekeeping, the top bars, and even the long Langstroth. That's easier to cycle through and just allow them to cycle out their old comb. Natural comb and natural cell are two very important aspects of this cultural control. And I'm going to talk about natural comb in a little bit, but this natural cell size. So there's a big debate about cell sizes in colonies, and especially with the Langstroth beekeepers, because a lot of them use foundation, which is pre-printed with specific sizes of cells. And usually the standard is 5.4 millimeter. Some people will go with smaller sizes, like 4.9 millimeters for the small cell, and all that good stuff. But in the end, you're dictating to the colony the size of the cells that they're using, where in reality, a colony going through the cycles of the seasons where they're expanding and contracting will need different sizes of cells for food, for brood, for queen rearing, for drone rearing. And then in addition, even in a single comb or frame, they will have at the top larger cells, and usually they will even have in a natural comb a portion that's a drone, a portion that's a worker, and all that stuff helps the colony. There's a purpose to everything the bees do. And when we override that purpose, we take away some of those defenses that they have, against the pests and pathogens. In particular, in this case, if you use large cell, the 5.4 millimeter, the standard that's on your plastic foundation, you're going to end up with bigger cells, which means your bees are going to take longer to develop, which means that's going to give more time to the Veramites to have more daughters in their cycles. And so instead of being more on the 1 to 1.5 offspring, you're going to be more on the 2 to 3 offspring. And that exponentially increases the risk of an infestation when it comes to the mites. Let me go back for a second. Something I didn't mention earlier. The recommendation with IPM is usually to count your mites and certain levels of thresholds you want to intervene, because the standard currently in the beekeeping industry is over 3 mites per 100 bees. You have an issue. What I would like to say about this is that there's plenty of colonies out there that do really well with super high mite thresholds. It is not necessarily, and I know this is controversial, but we see that in reality on a regular basis. We have some colonies that have higher mites and that have zero problems. And then we see some colonies that have low mites and that have a ton of problems. So it's not really necessarily a good indicator of the quality of your genetics. So keep that in mind as well. The brood breaks, we talked about it. We talked about the natural way to do brood breaks. They let the bees do that and follow their cycles of expansion and contractions. It's perfectly normal for a colony in the early spring, very early spring or late fall to not have any brood. And very often people panic and they're like, well, my queen's not laying, and there's nothing wrong with that. And if anything, it can help if everything else looks good. with the control of your Veramites. And that's what usually those local survivor stock do really well with that. Stress control, you don't want any stressors. That includes things like nutrition. Obviously, a skinny bee will have higher problems than a fat bee. You want your bees well fed and happy, and especially going into winter, you want those fat bees, those winter bees. But it has to be done naturally. You don't want them to be obese. You want them to be naturally healthy instead of rickety, right? But you don't want to pump them up with sugar syrup or pollen supplements. Strong colonies, larger colonies tend to do better, and then a good environment where there's not a food desert or monocultures or a lot of pesticides and fungicides. All that stuff is going to add more pressure. So if you can avoid it, it's better. So good forage is good. And not all of that stuff is within our control, but it's something to keep in mind. I was going to say something else, but that's okay. It'll come back to me. And by the way, if you have questions, feel free to type them in the chat window. I will address them at the end, and we'll take it from there. So foundationless and natural wax, to kind of hammer that point home. The wax has got about 300 different chemical components to it, and it really holds, believe it or not, a history and a memory of the superorganism via those chemical signals that it transfers. And so it's very important to the colony, actually. It's kind of like that blueprint, this information coming out of it for the bees that we might not be aware of, but it doesn't mean that it's not important to the colony. It also acts as a sponge and will remove toxins from the colony in the honey. It's lipophilic, it will absorb fats, and it will just get some of those toxins out by literally sucking it out of the brood cells and some of the food stuff. The bees use vibrations a lot for communication through their dances, the waggle dance, the round dance, all these dances that they do on the bee, on the comb. And that frequency resonates so much better on natural comb than it does on foundation, because the foundation provides so much more structure and rigidity to the comb, which is great for the beekeeper, but not so great for the bees. So if you can, I would encourage you to switch, and you don't have to do it overnight. You could just kind of like slowly switch some frames, especially if you already have some that is drawn to use as a guide, to switch your comb from your frames and your bars to natural. Well, in the top bar hive, it's a natural comb, so it's already there. But in Langstroth, I would encourage you to cycle your foundation, your plastic foundation especially, out and let the bees build their own comb to their liking. It's going to really make a difference in their health overall. And the other thing that is going to make a difference with is the efficiency of the messages and how they're being transferred. It's an information highway. Those vibrations are really going to be dulled out if you've got that damper that the foundation is, the rigidity of that foundation, which means they're going to be much less efficient at going foraging and collecting the resources that they need or communicating about issues. And then finally, we talked about that earlier, allowing for natural comb is going to allow them to build the cells to the size they need and not overly big. So it's better to go natural comb. So that was for the cultural controls and sanitation. And I know we're diving really deep into the integrated pest management pyramid, because I think that all beekeepers should be aware of this and use this as their tool to keep healthy colonies and not resort to chemicals. And we'll get back to that. But the level 3 of the pyramid is the physical and mechanical. At this point, there's still no treatments per se, like no chemicals. Those are interventions. They're not considered treatments, they're interventions and prevention measures. So physical and mechanical are another level of the pyramid that we use. And basically what it does is that it mechanically prevents or traps the pests that are in a colony to minimize their base population. So things like equipment that is in good physical repair is very important. You don't want cracks and crevices that lets those pests coming through. physically. You want to make sure that also you keep small entrances as much as possible. You don't want a traffic jam, but you want them to be small as possible. The bees naturally will reduce that using propolis. And there's a reason that they do that. And there's also a reason that they pick natural cavities that have small entrances. So we should respect that because that's what's best for them. And then, so on Langstroth, I would say, wanted to mention something that some of you might not be aware of, and that very often you have a box and then you have a bottom board and sometimes an entrance reducer, and that's fine. However, we find it highly practical to use a solid bottom board that's attached to the brood box, and use one of those disc entrance reducers. And I don't have one here, but just drill a hole at the bottom of your box, staple or screw on the bottom, just a board to the bottom of your bottom box, and then put one of those disc entrance reducers, and that's going to allow you to throttle, I guess, the opening as needed against robbers and weather and things like that. And if you have a bigger hole, you can even use that. And Jennifer, I'm talking about you a lot, but you can even use that kind of stuff as a vacuum. You know, you can make your own vacuum for removals and things like that. So that helps. The rough cut wood, if you can get your hands on rough cut woods, it's easier to do with top bar hives because we can build them with like scrap wood and very little precision when it comes to the milling and the assembly of the hive. It's a little bit harder to do with Langstroth, where everything is smooth usually. But if you can get your hand on something that's rough cut, it's going to allow the bees to cover it better with propolis and increase their immune system, because that's what the propolis does here. And that's going to, the more the propolis into the colony, the better it is. And by the way, that's another physical and mechanical thing, and cultural at the same time, thing that is important to the colony. You want to favor bees that have more propolis production, that use propolis a lot. I know that for Langstroth, it's a little bit sticky and it makes it hard to remove those frames. It's not an issue for the top bar hives, but it really is going to make a difference in their health as well. Usually heavy propolizers have better health. And then you can use things like mechanical traps. For example, the small hive beetles, the mineral oil traps, and the CD cases, and even the Swiffer sheets that you use for small hive beetles are a good example. Barriers against mice. You want to make sure bees can get in and out, but mice cannot get in and out. We had some issues because we, for the first time ever, we were in overwintering in a field, like a really country field with a lot of field mice, and we batted down the hatches as well as we usually do, but some mice got into our equipment. So I would recommend putting in, so you can use the I think it's the 1/4 inch mesh or fencing, and you can staple it in front. So it's too small for the mice to get in, but it's big enough for the bees to get in. That's one way to do this. There's other ways. Let's talk about drone trapping and drone culling. So one of the IPM strategies is to use the drone to cut out the drone comb, because in theory that's where the mites will reproduce the most. So the theory is if you cull it out, you're gonna take out a bunch of that mite population. And then the trapping for Langstroth, those green frames that you put in there, you let them build some drone comb, and then you remove the whole thing. So either cutting it out, which is the culling, or removing it out. And we don't do it because we believe that the drones serve a purpose, and including in insulation of your brood's nest, by the way. So if you cut out all the drone brood and you've got a cold snap, that layer of insulation is not there anymore. So just know that's the case. And also, if everybody does the same thing, drone trapping and drone culling, then you're going to impoverish the genetics, because there's not going to be as much mixing of genetics around. So it's better to do the other things, in my opinion, than to do this one. Plus, it's a lot of work. Powder sugar application. That's another mechanical way to try to knock back the population of mites, especially. The theory is that you can sprinkle the powdered sugar in the hive and cover everything so that the bees will groom themselves and knock off the mites, and then they won't come back, especially if you have a sticky board or oil trap at the bottom. That's another one. An oil trap or a sticky board is a mechanical strategy. However, I would caution against that one because the powdered sugar especially has cornstarch in it, and so it can clog up the spiracles of the larvae and smother them, and I think that's kind of stressful. Personally, if you're going to do that, I would recommend using white granulated sugar that you have mixed and grinded into a powder instead of the powdered sugar, confection sugar that you would get from the store. And barriers, we talked about that. The solid bottom boards are better than the screen bottom boards in our opinion, because, and it's kind of why it's in red here, it was one of the strategies recommended a while ago. It's no longer so much an recommended strategy, but I wanted to put it there anyway because it's important to know that, again, it lets the small hive beetles through, it lets the chemical compounds, volatile compounds that are in the colony get out, and that's another stressor. I think it's harder for them to control the levels of humidity and temperature. And honestly, people that are proponents of screen bottom boards mention things like it's better for aeration, and when it's hot in Texas, it's a big one that I hear. However, honeybees are better able to control their temperature when they've got the control of the flows, and you don't have that with a screen bottom board. It's kind of leaving the door open in an air-conditioned room. You're not getting the results that you want. They can do the air conditioning a lot better, but if we leave the door open for them, that's not going to be good. In addition, bees get very confused when they come back. Very often you'll see clumps of, so it will attract some pests and pathogens, some pests, but in addition, you will see sometimes a clump of bees underneath the screen bottom board, and they'll even start sometimes building comb underneath. So it's very confusing for them as well. There's so many reasons why I do not like those, and I don't recommend those. What was I going to say? Yes, let's go back to the powdered sugar application and some of the drone trapping and culling real quick. The intervention here is to decrease the levels of mites, physically decrease the levels of mites. But in doing so, we are still helping a colony that should learn how to develop strategies of their own to either knock back the levels of mites or learn to live with them and thrive despite their presence in a symbiotic relationship. So we'll talk about that in a little bit. But the equipment and physical repair like this, that's not what you want, because you're going to end up with issues. Moisture, pests coming in, it's just not a good idea. So we usually stop at this level. We don't really do anything else. And we don't, some of the ones that I talked about, powder sugar application, drone trapping and culling, we don't even do that. And if you want to do them, that's fine. But know that you're helping the bees instead of letting them stand on their own 2 feet a little bit more. So that's why now we're switching to the red light at the top right. But the level 4 is biological. So it's a controversial a little bit level. However, it can work. And some of the interventions at that level have been shown to work in some cases and not be toxic to the colony. So that's the important part. This is still not toxic to the colony. So things like predators. Predators of the mites, predators of the small hive beetles, or the wax moth larvae, parasitoids. So there's some. So basically, the 3 categories are predators, parasitoids, and pathogens. And things like entomopathogenic fungi or microbes, nematodes. We talked about those. That's a picture right here of a nematode in the ground. Califers, which are pseudoscorpions, which feed on Veramites, and bacillus, which is basically other bacillus that are competing with things. And also, so let me break it down. You've got Bacillus is the one that's used very often for wax moths control of the larvae is Bacillus thuringiensis, BT. One of the brands that was used for a while is called Certain, and there was another brand for a while, but it was not being used widely, so it got discontinued. It's back on the market, and you can use that to dilute that powder into a spray bottle. Excuse me, and then spray your comb before, like this kind of comb, before you store it, so that the larvae of the wax moth is very targeted to the larvae of the wax moths, and then it will not be able to grow on this kind of comb that's been sprayed. So before you store it away, you spray it with that, and it doesn't hurt the bees. It's very targeted to the wax moth larvae. That's the Bacillus example. The nematodes, that's, we talked about it in the ground for the small hive beetles. And then the parasitic parasitoids, there's a parasitic wasp that's called Trichogramma, that's been researched, that you can put into a colony, and it will basically parasitize some of the I think it was the mites, but I'll have to confirm. I have an article I can send you guys about that. That was very fascinating. And then there's definitely a fungi that can be used as a biological agent against the Varamite. It's a Hirsutella thompsoni, and it apparently hurts the mites as well. So those are biological control. However, I'm a little, we don't use those for the following reasons. One, I'm always a little fearful of introducing anything into a colony or in an environment, for that matter, that we don't know what possible and unintended consequences might be. The other thing is that they are very limited in their efficiency, meaning that usually you have to keep reapplying, and so that makes it very cumbersome. The third point is that if you have the other steps underneath that line covered, you don't even need those anyway. So that's why we don't use that level. So that was for the biological level. And then let's talk about the big one. The one that we don't use ever is chemical treatments. And chemical treatments are toxic, both to the honeybees and in some cases us. But that covers things like soft chemicals. Essential oils are a soft chemical and a chemical treatment. Things like thymol, ApiGuard, Apilavar, whatever the formula is, and Honeybee Healthy essential oils you put in the colony, and especially in concentrations like thymol used as a treatment, that's like super high concentrations. Yes, it exists in nature, formic acid and things like that also, that exists in nature, but not to those concentration levels, and it can have negative consequences on the colony. Essential oils that the bees ingest or that are used as a smell attractant for the pollen patties and things like that, or your syrup, they can coat, if they're ingested, they can coat the gut of the bee and make them sick, or unable to absorb some of the nutrients. It's just not a good idea. They also cover up the chemical messages, those pheromones that they're using to communicate, those smells that they're using to communicate. And so it kind of disrupts the communication messages in the colony. And I think that for that matter, it can also have unintended consequences and decrease the efficiencies of foraging and colony well-being. Let's talk about the acids. Very often they're touted as organic treatments, quote unquote, because they're found in nature. Formic acid is found in nature. Oxalic acid is in spinach. It's some level of it has been found, I think, in the honey. HopGuard 2 is hop beta acids. So those are organic acids. However, the concentration at which they're being used is not found in nature, which makes them toxic. And also oxalic acid, for those of you who didn't know, is wood bleach. So I'm not about to put wood bleach in my colonies. The concentrations can be so high that it can be hurtful to human beings as well and leave residues in some cases. But the underlying premise is that they're using those high concentrations as a quasi-mechanical way to hurt the mites. And the theory behind all those treatments, by the way, at the top, is that they're going to hurt the mites more than they hurt the colony. However, they do all have an impact on the colony, especially those synthetic chemicals. Examples are Apivar, Apiston, Checkmite Plus, things that are synthetically produced that don't exist in nature at all, to treat your bees. And then the other category is all the antibiotics that are used for the foul broods and, fumagillin, terramycin, all those antibiotics that are used in some circumstances to knock back some of the bacteria in a colony. So let's talk about this. These are the examples that we were going through. Even some paramoth balls, I think it's paradichlorine, benzene or something. It's some kind of really toxic thing as well. And they can be used on the comb as you store it away, and then you have to aerate them and for a while. And I don't trust that it's not going to leave any residues. The problem is that it's going to potentially leave residues in your honey, in your wax, which is why, by the way, you don't apply oxalic acid when you have honey supers on that would bleach. You also need very often, you can do it two ways with the oxalic acid. You can dribble it and you can sublimate it, which is not fumigation, by the way. Everybody says as a fumigation, it's sublimation technically. But you're going to end up having to wear all those acids that I was talking about, a breathing mask, like I forget what it's called, like a super duper mask, some gloves to protect your skin and your eyes. And if you breathe that stuff in, it can actually permanently damage your lungs. So it's not good for the bees, but it's not good for the beekeepers either. And they're not good for the bees. You see a lot of things like adult kills. You have some hives that get set on fire without sublimation because they're using the car batteries and everything gets hot, and the wax is flammable, highly flammable. So there's a lot of hives that go up in smoke. But mostly what I would say before I get into a little bit more of that is that it's about prevention. And too many beekeepers start with using those treatments and say, well, that's what I need. And instead of resorting to the other interventions. And so, yes, it's easier to just fumigate and sprinkle in and whatever, put a tablet into your hive. It's less work than having to understand all the knowledge that you have about the pests and the pathogens and the bees, to do the cultural control and to make sure that all the other stuff is in check. But it's just really better to do prevention than intervention. So because it decreases the stress on the colony, it makes them healthier. The other thing I would say is that here's the thing, if you buy treated bees, you're going to get bees that are weaker genetically, and you're going to have to treat them or they're not going to make it. Too often what happens is that when you have people that are buying bees and want to use those lower 3 levels of the pyramid and avoid chemical intervention, if you get bees that are used to being treated and that rely on that to be healthy, then they're not going to do well because you're cutting off their supply and they're going to fall prey to the things that they're not resistant to. So it's toxic and it's better to do prevention. And what I would say is that basically you don't want to flip the pyramid on its head. Too many beekeepers, 90% of beekeepers, they start at the wrong end of the pyramid. And just like it's bad for the food pyramid, it's bad for the management of pests and pathogens and the health of our honeybees. So please don't do that. If you can avoid it, don't use those chemical controls. They should be kept for things that are really specific. As backyard beekeepers, we're not piling a bunch of animals on top of each other in stressful conditions and then transporting them from one end of the country to the other. So we don't have to keep our bees the same way as people that do. Meaning backyard beekeepers have the luxury to keep their bees naturally and to do the things that are important to prevent having to resort to those chemicals. So that's kind of like something important to keep in mind. Chemical control has impact. All of these have negative impacts. So that's to hammer back down that point, is that they all have issues, whether it be with adult kills, brood kills, queen queen kills, lower fertility, lower longevity, things like queen events, a lot more supersedures. They have a lot of them are very temperature dependent and have frames of windows that are very restrictive, and then you have to rotate through them so that there's no resistance that develops. So I don't know about you, but not only do I know this is not good for my bees, but on top of that, I do not want to go through the headache and the expense and the investment of time that it takes to do this. Honestly, I really don't want to do that, especially because I know that I don't have to. And let's be honest, saying that it's good for the bees but bad for the mites, I'm not really sure that's really the case. The University of Cornell has shown several of those products have actual negative impacts on the bees. So this is another, another study that shows this kind of risk associated with chemical treatments. So if you're going to use those, be mindful of the potential negative effects that they do have. It's a trade-off. You might be knocking back down the population of mites, but you're stressing the colony, and so in the end, it's kind of like, why are we doing it if the end game is null, right? If you don't have that much coming out of it. Organic treatments, we talked about that. That's the concentration, the dose that makes the poison. I wanted to bring up the tools for viral management from the Honeybee Health Coalition that's brought up quite often when we talk about taking care of our bees and integrated pest management. And it's recommended across the board as, a booklet of reference when it comes to all those interventions, the chemical interventions. However, if you read through this very carefully and you notice that none of those have either a real impact or an impact that's higher than 30 to 40%. And by the way, the one that was the most efficient was to requeen using resilient local survivor stock. So when I was insisting on the using local survivor stock, if you don't have that now, what you can do is requeen. You can keep your bees, and if you had like treated Italians from Georgia in Texas, those are bees that are going to be weaker. However, if you requeen with local survivor stock from a reputable breeder, or you raise your own queen in a way that they're allowed to bring in some of those genetics, or you find somebody that, again, there's people that sell those queens, then you're going to replace the genetic makeup of your colony, and all of a sudden you're going to have that resiliency, those genetics that are going to allow you to do well. And I wanted to remind everybody that for any one hive that was treated and survived, there's another one that was treated and didn't survive. It doesn't mean that it's going to save and rescue your bees. It's not going to solve all your problems. If you've got problems with your queens and they're poorly mated and they're poor genetics, they're not adapted, or you have issues with the environment, they're not well fed, and all that stuff's not going to get resolved if you treat. So that's not the magic bullet. And also, for all those hives that have been treated and survived, there's also a hive that's recovered from issues and survived naturally using some of those lower levels of the intervention. Over time, the bees that are raised without treatments actually learn strategies to fend off for themselves, and that produces hardier bees. And also, it doesn't, if you're using the treatments, you're not enabling your bees to develop those strategies and to get stronger, but you do allow the mites to get stronger and to breed. And so in Africa and Australia doesn't have that issue, but in Australia and places in the Caribbean and other places where they've let the mites kind of run their course because either chemical treatments were not available or they were too expensive, the bees are naturally resilient and resistant, and they have Viramites, but they're thriving. Whereas here it's said that if we had started with letting the bees kind of learn to fend off for themselves, it would have taken about a couple, 3 years, and then we wouldn't be where we are at today. So there's food for thought. What about those Viramites bombs that we hear a lot of? So it's easier to keep bees naturally in an environment where you don't have a lot of treated bees. So in effect, for me, having the chance of living in an area that doesn't have a lot of treated bees allows me more easily to have healthy bees that are not impacted by the treated bees around. They can be impacted in two ways. The treated colonies have mites that are more virulent because they have to survive those treatments. And then those mites might end up in my hives. So there's more pressure in my hives. That makes it harder to be natural, treatment-free at that point. The other thing is that I don't like that Veramite bomb term, the mite bomb term, because I think it's so shocking and trying to really scare people emotionally into treating their bees. But tongue in cheek, let's humor me for a second. Let's use the term for ourselves as well and say, what about those treated drone bombs? When you have a queen that mates with treated drones in proportions that are higher than non-treated drones, you end up with a higher proportion of unviable or poor quality sperm in her spermatica that's going to take that much more space. So that's going to make for poor genetics in the hive as well, and potentially, you know, some of that spotty brood pattern, as some of that sperm is dead, right, or bad. So I that's just kind of a little humor, beekeeping humor on that, as far as I'm concerned. But and then last, these are some additional thoughts to keep in mind, because when we are doing vertical beekeeping versus horizontal beekeeping, there's also things that help the bees be healthier. And that's a little bit of a bias. I know some of you in the background that I know have heard me before are probably chuckling right now. You know who you are. But let's talk about horizontal versus vertical beekeeping, and how in horizontal beekeeping, you have only one direction. The bird's nest expands horizontally and contracts horizontally. It's very easy to manage because you know where everything is. There's no vertical aspect to it. But in vertical beekeeping, you have a little bit of that with the number of frames that you have. And as the colony expands and contracts throughout the seasons, but you're also adding an element of verticality. So this is actually neither here nor there. This is about 2 colonies in one hive. You can do that in tabar hives. You cannot really do that as easily in a Langstroth hive. But here's what I wanted to talk about. The Langstroth hive has that vertical aspect, and then you end up with the horizontal aspect as well. So that really makes it, so there's that aspect of, when the bees build in nature, they're building their comb straight down, usually from a ceiling, and they're not used to, whenever they start at the ceiling, having that ceiling removed and empty space put on top of it, which completely changes the thermodynamics of the colony. And all of a sudden, they've got that stressful empty cavity above their head that they were not prepared to manage. So that's one thing. The other thing is that when you open those hives, you're exposing the entire bird's nest at once. Whereas when you were with the tabar hive, you only, like, if you were to open a couple of those bars, then you can move the other bars and you're not exposing the bird's nest. You're just looking at the back edge of the colony, and you don't have to stress them and lose those chemical compounds, volatile compounds, or any of that stuff. By the way, I forgot to mention, don't always look for your queen. That's a big beginner beekeeper myth. You shouldn't be looking for your queen unless you're doing something very specific. Do not go ruffle through your entire bird's nest every time you go into the hive, and don't stay in there for too long, because it's very stressful to the colony. Your queen, if you see signs of her when it's the season where they're expanding, that's usually eggs or young larvae or even capped brood. Things should be, you know, telling you she's there. You don't need to find her. If it's in a contraction period, a dearth, and you don't have eggs, but the or young larvae or even any brood, but the colony looks calm and peaceful and going about its business, you don't even have to look for her either. Chances are she's there. If the colony acts all nervous and defensive and gets in your face, then you need to dig a little deeper. But don't look for your queen all the time. Please don't. So to come back to the vertical beekeeping, So we talked about the empty space above head. There's also the fact that you're got to move those frames constantly from one box to the other if you're managing them, and just kind of, you end up with, this is more of bias of mine. It's not so much with the integrated pest management pyramid, to be honest with you. But then what do you do with those? When you have a box, you have to have the right number in there or they'll build through. And when you have too many of them, what do you do with these extra ones? It's just kind of a pain. Then you have to manage up and down. And like I said, brood's nest is green, honey is yellow. So reversing of the boxes, adding supers, reversing things. And it's just kind of stressful to the colony, in my opinion. And then you end up with all that to store. The Langstroth beekeepers, and I'm one of them, but I'm transitioning out because I'm just getting tired of the flimsy frame and the musical frame playing up and down, and the equipment to store. You end up with all that stuff to store, and then you have that comb that's sitting there that you are keeping because you want to keep reusing it. And I think it should be, it's healthy for the bees to make wax and replace the wax that they've got, right? So just kind of get out of, I mean, I think it has an impact. So there's nothing wrong with vertical beekeeping in Langstroth. However, know that you're leaving some of the advantages of horizontal beekeeping on the table. And talking about Tabar hives, if you want to try your hand at it, we have some free plans on our website and some more info on those. So feel free, if you're like, it's really easy to make. If I can make it, anybody can make it. It doesn't take a lot of precision milling. It doesn't take a lot of woodworking skills. And really, I mean, I like doing it at waist level, not lifting any heavy weight, and maximum 7 to 8 pounds at a time. So I really, really recommend it. The bees are calmer. They seem healthier than in our Langstroth. So that's why I put it in here. So, and this is where I was mentioning, I've kind of changed my slides a little bit, so it's a little bit less structured, but let's go through it. Where to get bee colonies. So we talked about swarms. You can catch those, you can trap them. We have peat pots, pulp pots that you can use, or you can make your own swarm traps, or you can get lucky and go and catch them. Have the equipment that you need to do that. We talked about the fact that you can get some really cool genetics. If you're lucky and you get actual local survivor stock, you might end up with some of those managed stock, and some of it might do well. So you give it a chance, and if it doesn't do well, then requeen with local survivor stock. But don't do it first. Just wait for them to show you what they can do first. And then if you don't have swarms and you want to make sure you're getting bees, you could buy bees. And the two options mostly are packages and nukes. And so packages are those 3 pounds of bees, a queen that's not their mother. You shake them or set them up in your hive. It works with both with Langstroth and Tabar hives. And we have, again, that map of providers on our website. But also, if you're local to Texas and near Austin especially, you're not too far from Houston, but we work with bee weavers. They have local and treated survivor stock. So we got the group order from for the HayesCountyBeekeepers.com through them. So if you go to HayesCountyBeekeepers.com/store, it's hidden on the right side here. You can see we're almost out of packages though. But if you've got Langstroth, you can also get the nukes. And I think Jennifer might have some nukes. I don't know, but we'll look at the chat window in a little bit and when we open for questions. But you can purchase those as well and put them in your boxes. But again, local and treated survivor stock is highly recommended for this. Same thing with Tabar nukes. We were selling some last year. We decided to get out of that because there's so many ways people can get bees into their Tabars from other, not nukes, but there's other ways to do this. And if you go to my Instagram, I'm very excited about this. If you go to Be Mindful Honey Farms on Instagram, and I'm going to post it to our Facebook page, I just filmed yesterday a video on how to transfer Langstroth nukes to Tabar hives. And you can put if you have Langstroth, you can put them in that Langstroth nuke box and transfer them over. So if you want to give it a try, use those plans I just gave you and that video, and then you're in business. Some of the resources, the Hayes County Beekeepers Association is also another natural beekeeper association, but you have the Houston Natural Beekeepers, so I'm not gonna take too much time on that. And you're in Houston, but for those of us that are a little bit closer to Austin, there's the HCBA Beekeeping Store. So they're also a natural beekeeping club. So that's why we work really well with Therese and the Houston Natural Beekeepers, because we believe in the same message of keeping chemicals out of our colonies. So in conclusion, I would say it's important to have a toolkit of best practices to prevent and address most issues, and that those IPM strategies provide those tools. The other thing is that I really would like us to tune into the wisdom of the hive and to trust that the bees have been doing this for millions of years, and the fact that it's all interconnected, and our interventions always have unintended consequences, so we should minimize them and just kind of keep in mind that the bees should be first, and as opposed to the beekeeper, in my opinion. The honeybee is an animal that deserves to be in good health. And to me, pouring chemicals into a hive is not the way to do this. So I recommend let the bees teach us what works and what doesn't, and kind of adapt around that, and respect their free wills and processes as much as we can. So instead of prophylactically treating them and prophylactically just on a schedule automatically treat them and to prevent problems, let's just kind of see what they do and teach us what they do, so that we can better learn. That's going to make us better beekeepers, actually. And again, keep in mind that our interventions always disrupt and stress their natural order. So let's have the serenity to accept the things we cannot change, the courage to change the things we can in a respectful and mindful way, and have the humility to know the difference for the bees, but also for the beekeeping community and our future generations of beekeepers. Thank you. If you are looking for us, again, this is our contact information. We have, these are old, this is an old slide, but we have classes online, virtual, in person, hands-on. We even have a apprenticeship. But if you like this presentation and you would like to support us in our message and our spreading the information about natural beekeeping, we have just entered the small business grant that the contest that FedEx offers. So if you're so inclined and so kind to do so, we would appreciate and be so grateful if you could vote for us by going to the website and looking for Be Mindful. And you can vote every day between now and March 24th. And that's going to help us get noticed and have a chance at getting a grant from FedEx. And our goal is to get mobile classroom / commercial extraction kitchen that we can take out to communities that don't have access to that, to teach them beekeeping, natural, sustainable beekeeping, and while spreading, creating ways for them to learn how to make a dignified income using honeybees, but in a sustainable way. So we thank you. And at this point, I would like to know if anybody has questions. This is our profile on there. But this was the end of my presentation, and I'm open for questions at this point. Let me see if I can get to, where are you guys? There we are. And how do I get, there we go. Questions. Therese, do you have where's my chat window? I cannot find it. Stop share. Let's do that. There we go. I do see the questions. Let me see. Okay. Genetics. Yes, Jennifer. Yes. Do you do mite counts? If so, what methods do you use? So far we haven't done mite counts because we don't see the purpose. It's not like we're going to treat when we find any issue. We're going to use those lower steps of the integrated pest management pyramid. However, we're discussing being able to prove our point a little bit more. So we're going to start doing mite counts, because what we see empirically is very often we might see some signs of mites, but the colony is otherwise thriving. So we want to have that data. We want to be able to have those arguments scientifically and to do the research that goes with that to prove that this is really working for us. So we're going to start doing that, and we're going to do it with the powdered sugar. I'm working with another young lady, Brittany, that's doing something similar. So she's going to do it with alcohol, I think. And Les Crowder and I are going to do it with powdered sugar. We've grinded ourselves, that doesn't have that cornstarch. So yes, Steve, we're gonna try that this year. Jennifer, what do you use to clean tools between hives? Alcohol. This is one thing I don't do, but now see I should. Yeah, we're kind of like, when we do it, I put it in my smoker. And so there's a couple of things that I have a hive tool that I leave in one of the yards, different hive tools. That doesn't minimize the issues between hives, but it does between apiaries. So when you have several bee yards, that's one way to do it. You could have a whole set of hive tools and smoker at the yard, excuse me, and then not transport it to another hive. You could also avoid transporting the hives from one place to the other. However, we do that. But to clean your hive tool, you could shove it in your smoker when it's still hot and basically disinfect with fire. Alcohol is a good thing. I'm not sure what else I would use. I need to do more of that, but we don't have diseases in our colonies, so we haven't had to do too much of that. However, I'm kind of like, it should be done preventively. So do as I said, not as I not as I do, kind of a thing. Agatha, wonderful. Oh, thank you, Agatha. I really appreciate it. Thank you. Therese, I noticed that my top bar hives in different apiaries survived the winter storm better than the Langstroth hives in the same locations. Is that what you all noticed too? That brings up a good point. Yes, we did as well. And what that brings up a good point on the physical control. We use 2-inch lumber on our top bar hives. So everything is so much better insulated that the bees are less exposed to the element. The Langstroth hives, so when Reverend Langstroth developed his concept of the vertical hive, he even made it with glass. There was some glass compartments or something that really was very well insulated. And the commercial industry is taking the concept of Reverend Langstroth and made it theirs because it was easier to stack those boxes. However, doing so, they also wanted to make them much lighter and cheaper to make. So they used that 1-inch wood to make it lighter, and the consequence is that it's thinner and half as insulated as the top bar hives. And the other additional, it's a double whammy. There's that, and the fact that, and Andrew in Canada is probably laughing at me because he's got Langstroth, and I know on my soapbox, but that's okay. I'll get through it. But the thermodynamics of the vertical beekeeping makes for chimney effects that you have your bird's nest at the bottom in the cold weather with all the honey on top, and that heat rises. It rises and hits that cold cover very often, and then will produce that condensation and drip down. But if anything, it's not very efficient. You want to keep that heat at the brood level, right? That's where you want that heat to stay, not on the honey. Yes, it's going to make the honey easier to process and absorb because it's got the moisture on it and it's a little bit warmer. But I think it's more important to keep the bees warm. And so there's ways. What we recommend is when you have Langstroth and it gets really cold, is put some insulation at the top of the box, not necessarily in Texas on the outside. I don't think it makes such a big difference for us because cold snaps don't last for months. But I would recommend that. If you can build them out of 2-inch lumber, then that's so much better for the bees because you have more insulation. And then the horizontal also makes it so that heat doesn't escape above the bird's nest. So to your point, I think that's a good observation. I think it's a valid observation. And I agree with you that for us, it was a little bit better. But, you know, there's a place for both types of beekeeping. However, I would say it's usually backyard beekeepers, it's easier to do beekeeping horizontally, and especially in the top bar hive. So, you know, I'm biased, but thank you for allowing me to say that one more time. Andrew, maybe I missed it, was transitioning a treated hive to untreated covered. Can I just stop, or is it a managed process over time? Good question. You can try to go cold turkey and see if they're going to make it. Chances are they're going to be struggling. But if they make it, then you have a hive that's recovered and that's, you know, able to fend for themselves. It might be that they do okay the second year and maybe struggle through their third year, and that might show in the longer run. However, I would give it a try, and we've seen packages from Georgia that was treated, and you know, I would say about half of them were doing okay and the other ones didn't. So at that point, if you see that it starts not being okay, you can get a queen for, I know in Canada it's kind of hard because I think you guys are treating, but you can get a queen from local survivor stock and just requeen your colony, and you're not losing your colony. In effect, what that does though, and people like Dr. Seeley says, if you have a colony that's falling to mites, you should euthanize it. And if it's not doing well, you should euthanize it if you're not going to treat it, because you don't want those mites and those issues to be propagated around horizontally. You know, where was I going with this? My point is that if you requeen, every time you requeen, you're euthanizing a colony, right? In effect. Follow me for a second, entertain me with this idea, because you are still left with the bees that are in the colony to raise, you know, brood and food and all that stuff, and then you bring in that new queen. Well, those bees that are still left in there, they're going to die, and all those genetics from that previous queen are going to die, and they're going to be gone, and they're going to be slowly replaced by the genetics of that new queen. So in effect, what you have done is you have euthanized that queen with the weaker genetics. So we are, as natural beekeepers, this is our biggest tool, is to be able to requeen. It is an intervention, but because we're doing it, we're expanding and we're doing things, we need to get our bees, you know, going. We like to do that as a intervention when it's necessary, but we don't do it lightly, because it is stressful to the colony. And you know, sometimes there's something to be said about colonies learning to fend off for themselves, but that's kind of where I'm coming from on that. Thank you. Where do you get nematodes? I don't know, because I've never gotten them, but you might be able to find them on the beekeeping catalogs and supply companies. Yes, you have to reapply them frequently when you have too much rain. Actually, the problem is when it gets dry. So in Texas, that's kind of an issue. And then at that point, they will die and you have to reapply. So that's why it's not really practical solution, although it's a potentially valid one. For finely crushed limestone for a hive base, where do you get it? You can go to your local stone suppliers. You know, they do that in bulk, and you can get either bags or you can get, you know, truckloads or whatever, depending on how much you need. That's okay, good. That's what Jennifer, I'm not sure which one it is. That's amazing to hear. That's what I've done. It looks good to know it works. Very good. So something I said. Jeffrey, you mentioned the spray to prevent the wax moths. What was the name of that spray? It is called, and I'm gonna type it here into the window. It's called Certain. There you go. And it's diluted, I think, in a spray bottle, and you spray it lightly on the comb, and then you kind of aerate it, and then you store it away. And at that point, if you put it in containers, by the way, the other thing that you can do is freeze your comb, and all beekeepers know that you can freeze it, but it takes a lot of space. So same way, Terrace. So in the same way, the reproduction of the male drone is compromised. Do the chemicals trapped in the combs hinder the reproductivity of the queen and her laying? It affects, I think, the ones that are trapped in the comb, the lipophilic treatments, well, the ones that are absorbed by the wax. will affect the brood for sure, and the queen rearing. So if you have new queens being reared in that wax, then that's an issue. Almost all the treatments, the chemical treatments, hinder the queen's reproductivity and her laying. They hinder her fecundity is the actual word. Everybody says fertility, but it's actually fecundity. And so and her longevity. So that since she's the kingpin in the colony, that's kind of a problem in itself. Harvey, is a flower garden a requirement for the bees to thrive, or is there an alternative? So bees forage in a radius of an average of 1 to 2 miles, and further if they need to, if they don't have enough forage in the area. All planting is going to help, and we recommend planting trees and bushes as well as wildflowers. Everybody's planting wildflowers, that's great, but it's very sporadic, very limited time frame, and it's very inefficient for the bees to go forage off of the flowers because they're all different and they gotta hop, and it's highly inefficient. If you plant bushes and trees, yes, they take longer, but that's more bang for their buck because there's so many tiny little flowers and they gotta go just one spot. And what they'll do, they'll specialize and they'll just pack only from that bush or tree, go back and keep doing it until there's no more. With the flowers, it's kind of like a scattered pattern and it's highly inefficient for them. So all planting of pollen and nectar producing plants will help. You're never going to be able to plant enough as one person for one hive or two hives. There's no way. But if everybody does that, then it's going to help the bees in general and the pollinators in general. So what is also very important, and we didn't talk about that, is a good water source. You don't want them to have to go 2 miles down the road to get water. It's highly inefficient and they need a lot of water. So clean water that's not toxic is a good idea. Jennifer, I noticed that my lines would not move up to the honey, and the ones that did survive have almost consumed the whole box above already. So that this is exciting because this is exactly what I'm talking about. That empty space above their head is waste of that heat, and they struggled and they worked so much harder to keep their nests warmer when they have that empty space above. So it's almost better to have less above their head. And like you said, the ones that were at the level where the honey was, and they didn't waste that energy, in my opinion, above their head, they probably did better because of that. So that makes sense to me. I will be using top bars more. Hours at the Bee Club yard did fine. That's awesome. Well, Jennifer, I know you're very handy, so look at the plans on our website. And if you need info, we're doing a top bar hive making workshop this coming Saturday in Austin, and we're planning on organizing one in Houston at some point. We're doing, Les and I are doing community outreach. We just got a grant for the FAM Houston, the community of Congolese women empowerment group. And we're doing a youth scholarship program there of 10 kids. We just got some money for them, and we're going to donate hives and the teaching, and we're going to come regularly, do a train to trainer over there. But what that means is that we're going to do top bar hive making workshop in Houston as well. So for those of you who are in Houston and you're interested in trying your hand at top bar hive making, that's the same class we're doing on Saturday here in Austin. Excuse me. It's going to be for the price of the hive. You get 4 hours of teaching on how to make them, how to manage them, and how to make more. And you get the hive home with you, a double top bar hive with you, and you get to work with Les Crowder, who's a legend when it comes to this. So, and natural beekeeping. So if you're interested, there's still space there, but you can find the info on our website, bee-mindful.com. Shameless plug, sorry. If your local Wabash feed store in the Heights has them, as well as ladybugs, I'm assuming that's the nematodes, Therese. Feel free to jump in if that's not the case. The Canadian says, freezing comb is easy in Canada. It's called stored in the barn in the winter. Good point. We had some of that for a week. We don't want to do that. What's the smallest entrance that is advised? The smallest one for small colonies in dearth, when there's robbing or issues and they cannot defend themselves at all, you can go as much as 1 bee, and then barely they can get out, but not 2 bees, and that's the smallest one. However, if you start seeing more traffic and it's starting to hinder their work, then you should progressively open it. The bees will naturally do it to, I would say, like a highlighter like this is about a good size. Like Les uses drill bits with the thick drills bits and drills directly into the walls of the tabar hives. He drills severals, and it's about 1 bee worth. And if that's too many openings, then he'll plug them with grass. So, you know, you got options there. Oh, well, please let us know when the tabar hive making class in Houston is. Absolutely, Terrace, you know, you'll be the first one. I'll let you know, and then you can let people know at that point. I appreciate that. Thank you. Benny, I'm interested in the tabar shop in Houston as well. So very cool. So what I'll do, Benny, is I will let Therese know. She'll be the point of contact, and she'll let you all know because she's going to have all your contact information. And yes, that was the nematodes. Very good. So I think that was the questions. Do you guys want to unmute yourselves and ask questions, or do you have more that you want to type? Speak now or forever hold your peace. Thoughts? Questions? Anyone? Bueller? No? Well, then if that's the case, I'll let Therese take back over and conclude this presentation, I guess.
Thank you so much, Natalie, for all that you taught us today.
Thank you so much.
And even if we've heard it before, it's great to get that reinforcement of the knowledge. That way we can share it with other people down the road.
Yeah, no, I appreciate it. And anytime, if you guys have questions, you know where to find me. And I'm always in for it. Thank you, Harvey. Appreciate it. Y'all were awesome. And thanks for your good questions and for your time. And I'm grateful that I was able to present here. Thank you, Susan. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Bye, guys.